Terry Bradshaw, 4 Super Bowl championships, 2 Super Bowl MVP awards, more than half a century standing firm amid the harshest pressures of American sports, a living monument who helped redefine the image of a winning quarterback in the steel era of the Pittsburgh Steelers. From a #1 pick once doubted and mocked, to the man who lifted 4 Lombardi trophies, Bradshaw conquered the most violent stage in football with a powerful arm, grit, and an unyielding will. Millions of Americans admire him as a symbol of strength, humor, and the ability to get back up after every hit. But behind that glory is a story that is not glamorous but painful. 3 marriages that successively fell apart. The pain of no longer being with his 2 daughters Rachel and Erin every day as before. Sleepless nights, times of bursting into tears, panic attacks that appeared while the entire country still saw him as a man who seemingly knew no fear. And then, before Super Bowl 33 in 1999, Bradshaw faced a moment almost impossible to believe. The man who had stepped into 4 Super Bowls with giant defenders charging straight at him was in a trailer before a television rehearsal and at times did not want to step outside. No blitz, no collisions, no ball in his hands, just Terry and his own mind. His 3rd marriage to Charla Hopkins was coming to an end. The home was falling apart, and Bradshaw later described himself in that period as an emotional wreck. He couldn't sleep, had trouble concentrating, often cried and realized this was no longer just the sadness after a divorce. He sought out a pastor, then a psychologist and a psychiatrist, before finally being diagnosed with clinical depression. For a man who grew up in a world where toughness was almost synonymous with silence, Bradshaw had to face the truth that willpower is not always enough to defeat his own mind. And now at the age of 77, after 4 Super Bowls, the Hall of Fame, more than 3 decades on Fox NFL Sunday, and 2 battles with cancer, what really happened behind Terry Bradshaw's laughter, and what price did he have to pay to always find his way back to the light? Before Pittsburgh had the chance to shake Terry Bradshaw's faith, he grew up in a world where a man's worth was often measured by what he could do, how much he could endure, and how long he could stand when no one came to the rescue. Terry was born on September 2, 1948 in Shreveport, Louisiana, in the family of William Bill Bradshaw and Novice Bradshaw, along with 2 brothers Gary and Craig. That was the American South of the post-war years, where church, labor, discipline, and self-reliance were not just habits but almost a value system. The Bradshaw family had a Baptist foundation, and Terry grew up in an environment that valued responsibility, faith, and toughness more than long self-reflections about emotions. There is no evidence to turn that childhood into a story of abuse or abandonment, but that very atmosphere taught him something very early. To be seen, you had to do something worth others looking at. For Terry, what helped him find his place was sports. At Woodlawn High School, his arm quickly became something that made others pay attention. He played quarterback, competed in track and field, and began building a very clear dream of one day becoming a professional player. On the field, everything seemed simpler than life. A pass was either accurate or it wasn't. A game was either won or lost. There, Terry didn't need to explain too much about who he was. He only needed to prove it through action. But behind that physical ability were difficulties that many years later he would have the language to name. Bradshaw once spoke about issues related to concentration, reading and remembering information, and later was diagnosed with ADD. That helps explain why, in some situations, he had to reread the same content many times before truly absorbing it, or needed more effort to remember details others might consider normal. In his youth, Terry did not yet have that explanation, and because of that, the mockery of his intelligence that he would later have to endure in the NFL was not just a harmless joke. It hit exactly the place he had spent years trying to compensate for with preparation and achievement. When Bradshaw arrived at Louisiana Tech, he learned another painful but necessary lesson. Talent does not guarantee that the stage will immediately belong to you. Phil Robertson was then holding the quarterback position, and Terry had to wait. For someone already accustomed to using performance to define his own worth, standing on the sidelines was not easy at all. He had the arm that scouts liked, had huge ambition, but still had to watch someone else hold the ball and accept that the opportunity had not come just because he wanted it to. That very period helped him learn a different kind of discipline, not just throwing harder or practicing more, but enduring the feeling of not being chosen without letting it destroy his belief in himself. When the opportunity finally appeared, Bradshaw did not let it slip away. He gradually took the starting role at Louisiana Tech and finished his college career with 7,149 passing yards and 42 touchdowns, numbers large enough to turn a kid from Shreveport into one of the most watched quarterback prospects in America. He was also chosen as MVP of the Senior Bowl, another confirmation that his strong arm and grit not only impressed at the college level, but were enough to make the NFL take notice. But behind those achievements, there still existed something notable. Bradshaw never walked with the feeling that everything naturally belonged to him. He had to wait at Louisiana Tech, had to prove himself when the chance came, and had to learn to live in the gap between the ability he believed he had and the recognition others were not yet ready to give. In 1970, the Pittsburgh Steelers selected Terry Bradshaw with the #1 pick in the entire NFL draft. For the rest of America, that was the moment a young talent was confirmed. For Terry, it was the promise that all those years of waiting had finally been rewarded. But he could not yet know that that #1 spot would also place a tremendous pressure on his shoulders, and that the city of Pittsburgh would soon make him question everything he had once believed about talent, intelligence, and his own worth. Pittsburgh did not crown Terry Bradshaw when he entered the NFL. That city first made him live long enough with the feeling that he might be a mistake. In 1970, Bradshaw arrived with the Steelers as the #1 overall draft pick, but the team he joined had just gone through a 1-13 season, a franchise desperately searching for someone to change its fate and almost without enough patience to wait for a young quarterback to mature step by step. On paper, Bradshaw had everything a team could dream of: a strong arm, ideal size, outstanding college production, and the belief of scouts that he could become the foundation for a new era. But the NFL did not care who a player had been at Louisiana Tech. The speed was faster. The defensive backs were smarter. Passing windows closed in an instant. Every decision had to be made before an ordinary person could even realize what was happening. And Terry, who had been used to using talent to answer every doubt, stepped for the first time into a world where that talent was not enough to protect him from humiliation. The rookie season became a cold audit. Only 38.1% of passes completed, 6 touchdowns and 24 interceptions. Those numbers did not allow any romantic story to exist. Each interception opened another question. Had Pittsburgh really chosen the right person? Was that strong arm worth anything if the quarterback could not process fast enough? And more painfully, was Bradshaw smart enough to play a position that required reading a defense in a few seconds? Those questions were not only aimed at performance, they struck straight at the part of himself that Terry had always been most sensitive about. He could take a sack. He could get up after a collision, but being turned into the example of a quarterback who had the arm but not the head was something much harder to shake from his mind. And Pittsburgh did not give him any guarantee just because the name Bradshaw had been called first on draft day. Terry Hanratty was still there. The competition for the position still existed. Every week Bradshaw had to prove again that he deserved to keep the job the entire country had once thought certainly belonged to him. That made the early years not only a journey of learning professional football, but also a journey of living with the feeling that his position could disappear at any moment. At the center of it all was Chuck Noll, the coach who would later, together with Bradshaw, build one of the greatest dynasties in NFL history. But the relationship between them was never simple. Noll was rational, reserved, strict, and believed a professional player had to understand his job without needing constant reassurance. Bradshaw was different. He was more emotional, more sensitive to judgment, and deep inside still needed a sign that his coach truly believed in him. That very distance allowed two people to win a great deal together and still not always understand each other. Bradshaw later carried no small amount of bitterness about the coldness he felt from Noll, because at the moments he needed an affirmation most, What he usually received was the demand to be better. But in the NFL of the 1970s, no one stopped to heal a quarterback's confidence. Either you played well enough, or someone else would play instead of you. And in 1974, the thing Bradshaw feared most happened at the most ironic time. The Steelers had finally become a team strong enough to think about a championship, but Bradshaw was not the one who opened the season as the #1 quarterback. Amid a player's strike, a minor injury to Bradshaw and Joe Gilliam's impressive performance in the preseason, Chuck Noll gave the starting job to Gilliam. After 4 years in the NFL, after all the doubts Bradshaw had tried to overcome, he entered the season that could change Pittsburgh's history by standing on the sideline watching someone else lead the team. This was no longer the story of a rookie learning the trade. This was a cold warning that the #1 pick, the potential and the years already spent, did not guarantee the future. If the Steelers won without him, Terry could be left behind by history right inside the franchise he had been chosen to save. And then the chance to return came. When Gilliam struggled, Bradshaw was put back on the field once more. There was no longer any glow from draft day, no longer any patience for potential. He had only one choice: play well enough to keep the job, or accept that both those who had doubted him and the fear inside his own head might have been right. Terry Bradshaw stepped back into the huddle with the reputation of a #1 pick standing on the brink of becoming a failure story. But from that moment that seemed as if everything could slip from his hands, Pittsburgh began to see a different person. No longer just the kid with the strong arm from Louisiana, no longer just the quarterback of 24 interceptions, but a man who had been replaced, doubted, forced to win back his own position, and still stepped back onto the field. And what Terry could not yet know then was that that last chance that seemed so small would open the path to the trophies Pittsburgh had waited for decades. The man who had been doubted, replaced, and stood on the sideline right in the season that could decide his future finally won back the quarterback position in 1974, and from that moment, the history of both Terry Bradshaw and the Pittsburgh Steelers began to change direction. After decades of failure and disappointment, Pittsburgh reached Super Bowl IX against the Minnesota Vikings, and Bradshaw stepped into the biggest game of his life no longer as a #1 pick trying to survive, but as the one entrusted with taking the entire franchise through a door they had never walked through. The Steelers won 16-6 and lifted the Lombardi Trophy for the first time in history. For Pittsburgh, that was the liberation of an entire city. For Bradshaw, it was the first proof that the years of being doubted, benched, and questioned might not have been meaningless. But one championship could still be seen as a lucky moment. Bradshaw needed more than that, and only 1 year later he had the chance to prove it. Super Bowl X against the Dallas Cowboys became a harsher game, where the Steelers had to rely on decisive moments between Bradshaw and Lynn Swann. When Pittsburgh needed a big play, Bradshaw threw a deep pass to Swann for a 64-yard touchdown, a play that helped the Steelers win 21-17 and defend the championship. 2 consecutive trophies changed the way America looked at Terry. He was no longer the young quarterback who only had a strong arm. He was becoming someone who could withstand the pressure of the biggest games. But what made Bradshaw's story more complete did not come immediately. For many years, there were still those who believed the Steelers' success belonged mainly to the Steel Curtain, to Franco Harris, to Lynn Swann, John Stallworth, and an almost perfect system around him. Terry won, but part of his reputation was still placed in question. Then 1978 arrived. Bradshaw had the best season of his career, throwing 28 touchdowns and being named NFL MVP. For the first time, it was no longer possible to simply say he was only the man standing in the middle of a great team. He had become one of the best quarterbacks in the league. But just when it seemed the old questions had finally disappeared, a mockery again hit the wound that had followed him from the earliest days. Before Super Bowl XIII, Dallas linebacker Thomas Hollywood Henderson publicly mocked Bradshaw's intelligence with the line that later became famous, that Bradshaw was so dumb he couldn't spell cat if given the letters C and T. That was not just trash talk. It struck what Terry had had to hear for years, that he could be strong, could throw far, but was not smart enough to truly become a great quarterback. Bradshaw did not answer with a long argument. He answered on the field. Against Dallas, he threw 318 yards, 4 touchdowns, and led the Steelers to a 35-31 win in one of the best Super Bowls of that era. When the game ended, Terry not only had the third Lombardi Trophy, he also had the Super Bowl MVP award, and the mockery of his intelligence suddenly became small in front of the scoreboard. The man who had been turned into a joke had now produced one of the greatest quarterback performances in Super Bowl history. And Bradshaw still did not stop. 1 year later, Pittsburgh faced the Los Angeles Rams in Super Bowl XIV. The game was not easy. The Steelers were dragged into a struggle and had to come back in the fourth quarter. Bradshaw finished with 309 passing yards, decisive throws to John Stallworth, and a second Super Bowl MVP award. Pittsburgh won 31-19. The fourth ring made Terry Bradshaw the first quarterback in history to win 4 Super Bowls. Only a few years earlier, he had had to watch Joe Gilliam start in his place. Now, no quarterback had more championships than he did. In that moment, it seemed all the humiliation had been repaid with glory. All the times of being doubted had been answered with trophies. All the questions about whether he was smart enough, stable enough, good enough, finally seemed to have an answer. Terry Bradshaw had won, Pittsburgh had won, and America could no longer look at him as a mistake. But behind those rings was something that era did not yet fully understand. Football of the 1970s was played with a level of violence that many quarterbacks today can hardly imagine. Bradshaw was hit constantly, slammed to the ground, had his head smashed, and then got up and kept playing as if that were just a normal part of the job. Many years later, he said he could remember at least 6 serious concussions that knocked him out completely. One of the most haunting hits happened in 1976, when Joe "Turkey" Jones of the Cleveland Browns lifted Bradshaw up and then slammed him down by the head and shoulder in a sack that is still shocking to watch. At the time, that was almost just seen as another violent NFL play. Terry got up, recovered, and continued his career. No one knew exactly what those hits would leave decades later, because while the entire country was counting 4 Super Bowl rings, Bradshaw's body was also quietly remembering every collision, every loss of consciousness, and every time he stood up before anyone had time to ask whether the man inside that helmet was really still okay. After 4 Super Bowl championships, there was a time when Terry Bradshaw seemed to have defeated everything that had ever stood in front of him. But football does not stop to protect those who made its history. In the early 1980s, the Steelers dynasty began to fall apart piece by piece. The teammates who had stood beside Bradshaw in those glorious winters successively grew older, suffered more injuries, slowed down, and the gap between the great past and the present became clearer. Terry was still there, still wearing number 12, still stepping into the huddle with the habit of a man who had spent almost his entire adult life calling the plays. But the body began to give back what those years of collisions had taken, especially the right elbow. The arm that had taken Pittsburgh to 4 Lombardi trophies began to become a source of pain that could not be ignored. In 1982, Bradshaw continued to play even though he had to use cortisone to control the pain. He could still throw, still lead, still make people believe that everything had not yet reached the end. But every throw was no longer measured only by yards or touchdowns. It was also measured by how much longer the elbow could endure. Terry had lived too long in a world where pain was seen as something to be overcome, not something that forced you to stop. So he continued. But by March of 1983, willpower was no longer enough to negotiate with the body. Bradshaw had to have elbow surgery and missed almost the entire season. For the first time, the man who had been so used to coming back after every hit had to sit out and watch the Steelers continue playing without him. There was no guarantee he would return, no promise that the arm would be the same again. And the scariest thing was not only losing football, it was the possibility that Terry Bradshaw could be forced to stop before he himself was ready to say goodbye. For months, he rehabbed with only one goal, to throw one more time. Then on December 10, 1983, at Shea Stadium, that chance finally came. Pittsburgh faced the New York Jets. Bradshaw stepped back onto the field after almost an entire season away, and for a few brief minutes it seemed time had reversed. He completed 5 of 8 passes, threw 77 yards and 2 touchdowns without an interception. For a man who had just gone through surgery and months without playing, that was a comeback enough to recall the image of the quarterback who had once dominated the biggest games. Perhaps right in that moment, Bradshaw also wanted to believe he was not yet finished, that the arm just needed more time, that a man who had overcome every doubt would overcome this one too. But then came the touchdown pass to Calvin Sweeney. Bradshaw threw the ball, touchdown. And almost at the same time, he felt the elbow react in a way that could not be mistaken. A pop, a pain, then he left the field. Terry Bradshaw did not know that was the last NFL pass of his life. No one staged a farewell. There was no farewell season for him to walk through every stadium one last time. There was no moment he stepped into the middle of the field and told Pittsburgh he was ready to stop. His last throw was a touchdown, but the ending did not feel like a victory at all. The arm that had given him fame, money, 4 championships, and an immortal place in NFL history finally became the thing that decided for him that the quarterback life was over. In the months after that, Bradshaw still had not completely let go of the thought of returning. But by 1984, he had to accept what the body had already told him. If there was another surgery, the goal would be to live a normal, healthy life, not to play football. That truth hurt in a way different from all the previous failures. When he was benched, he could win the position back. When he was mocked, he could answer with wins. When he was doubted, he could throw touchdowns. But this time there was no opponent to defeat, no scoreboard to reverse, only a part of the body that no longer allowed him to continue. And behind that ending there was still another wound, the relationship with Chuck Noll. The two had won 4 Super Bowls together, but Bradshaw for many years still carried the feeling that he had never received the emotional recognition he needed from the coach who had shaped his career. The sudden ending only made that feeling heavier. Later, age softened much of the bitterness, and Bradshaw even publicly apologized to Noll for things he had once said, but it cannot be denied that he left football without the kind of perfect closure people usually give a legend. However, as soon as one door closed, another began to open. CBS saw in Bradshaw something football no longer needed, but television could use: the voice, the humor, the experience, and a personality unlike anyone else. The man who had just lost the identity that had defined almost his entire adult life began to be given a new stage. But before Terry Bradshaw could become the one who made America laugh every weekend, he had to learn a lesson even harder than any playbook: how to keep living when he was no longer called a quarterback. After the right arm forced Terry Bradshaw to leave football, people might think the brightest part of his life was over. But in 1984, CBS opened another door, and for the first time Terry stepped onto a stage where he did not need to throw a ball to be seen. He began as a commentator, bringing the experience of a 4-time champion quarterback. But what made audiences gradually love him was not only football knowledge, it was the very traits that had once made him looked down upon: the distinctive Southern voice, the clumsiness, the unpolished way of speaking, and the ability to mock himself before others had the chance to do it. In 1994, when Fox NFL Sunday was born, Bradshaw became one of the central faces of the show, and from then on he built a television career that lasted far longer than the 14 seasons he had once played in the NFL. On the set, Terry did not try to become a cold analyst. He laughed loudly, argued, told stories, sometimes misspoke, and then turned his own mistake into a joke. Audiences did not just see a Hall of Famer, they saw a down-to-earth human being. And the almost perfect paradox is that the man who had been mocked for his speech, his appearance, and his intelligence became the one America paid to talk about football every Sunday. 3 sports Emmys afterward were proof that Terry had found a second identity. He was no longer just the former Pittsburgh quarterback. He was Terry Bradshaw of American television. But while the second career grew more and more stable, his private life went in the opposite direction. The first marriage to Melissa Babish ended very quickly. The second marriage to figure skater JoJo Starbuck also fell apart. Then Terry married Charla Hopkins, and this was his longest relationship at that time. Two daughters, Rachel and Erin, were born, giving Bradshaw a role that football and television could not replace: father. But even that did not protect the family from collapse. In 1999, the marriage to Charla ended, and this time Terry did not only lose a spouse, he lost the daily rhythm with his two daughters, lost the feeling of a stable home, and began to face an emptiness that fame could not fill. Bradshaw later described himself in that period as an emotional wreck. He once recounted that he lived in a barn with his dog, slept on the sofa, and felt as if he had lost his wife, lost his house, lost his money, but what hurt him most was no longer being with his children as before. That made him collapse in a way that failure on the field never had. On television, he could still step into the light, still make colleagues and audiences burst out laughing. But when the cameras turned off, what remained no longer resembled ordinary sadness after a divorce. He couldn't sleep. He cried. He could not concentrate. Panic attacks appeared that he could not explain with willpower or experience. Before Super Bowl 33, the very man who had stood in the middle of 4 Super Bowls with defenses charging straight at him at times did not want to step out of the trailer for rehearsal. There was no opponent in front of him, but his body and mind still reacted as if they were in danger. Bradshaw finally had to admit this was no longer something he could tough it out. He sought a pastor, then a psychologist, then a psychiatrist. The clinical depression diagnosis came as an explanation for many things he had never understood about himself. Terry began treatment, including medication, and more importantly, he decided to speak publicly about the illness. For a man who grew up in the football culture of the 1970s, where pain was often answered with, "Get up and play," admitting he needed help was not easy. But Bradshaw gradually understood that depression does not care how many rings a person has, how much money, or how many people are laughing because of him on television. It did not make him any less strong than what he had already proven on the field. And for the first time, Terry began to change the definition of strength. Before, being strong meant taking one more hit. Now, being strong also meant walking into the doctor's office, saying he was not okay, and allowing others to help him. The man who had spent a lifetime making America laugh finally understood that there are times when the bravest thing is not to keep laughing, but to tell the truth about why he cannot. After 3 divorces, after the years of having to learn to call his depression by its right name, Terry Bradshaw thought the biggest battles were already behind him. But football did not leave his body just because he had left the field. Many years after retiring, Terry publicly said he could remember at least 6 times being so severely concussed that he was completely unconscious, not counting the other hits that left his head spinning, and still having to go back and play as if that were just a normal part of the game. As age increased, those traces began to appear in a more frightening way. Bradshaw spoke about short-term memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and declining hand-eye coordination. At one point, he himself called his cognitive training "rehabbing my brain." The irony is almost cruel. This had been the quarterback who had to memorize the playbook, recognize personnel, read defensive fronts in a few seconds, and make a decision before a defender could rush in. Now, sitting in front of the camera, he had to be more careful with statistics, player names, and details that his mind used to process almost by instinct. That does not mean Bradshaw has been diagnosed with dementia or CTE, and he has not publicly announced such a diagnosis. But the worry about memory is real enough that he has had to change how he prepares, train his mind, and look back at the price of a football era where hits to the head were once seen as symbols of toughness. Also in those years, Terry began to understand that he could not continue living as if every problem had to be solved by himself. Tammy entered his life not as a miracle that erased the past, but as a very slow lesson in trust. After 3 failed marriages, Bradshaw no longer completely trusted his own judgment in love. He once spoke about counseling that lasted many years, and in 2026 even admitted that he had waited about 12 years before proposing to Tammy, because he was still haunted by the previous divorces. The man who could throw a ball into a small window between two defensive backs took more than a decade before he had enough courage to bet his heart one more time. The two finally married in 2014, but even that new love did not protect the family from loss. In 2009, Cody, Tammy's son from a previous marriage, died of an overdose. In 2014, Terry's daughter Rachel married NFL kicker Rob Bironis, then only a few months later became a widow when Bironis was killed in a car accident. Terry had lived in a world where a quarterback always had to find the next play, always had to fix a mistake with a new drive. But before the death of a child in the family or the pain of his own daughter, there was no play to call. There was no way to fix a loss with the next win. Then the body again brought him closer to another truth he could not control. In 2021, Bradshaw was diagnosed with bladder cancer and had to undergo treatment. Less than a year later, when checking a problem in the neck area, doctors discovered Merkel cell carcinoma, a rare and dangerous form of skin cancer. These were two different cancers, not one simple disease returning. For Terry, who had spent most of his adult life believing he could take one more hit if necessary, those two consecutive diagnoses made mortality no longer something that happened to other people. It had his own name on the medical records. But this time Bradshaw did not have to walk into the fight alone. Tammy was there, the children were there, the doctors were there, the family was there. He underwent treatment, recovered, and afterward publicly said he was cancer-free. What changed was not only health, it was the way Terry understood strength. When he was young, being strong meant getting up after a sack, hiding the pain, and going back to the huddle. When older, being strong sometimes simply meant admitting he was afraid, listening to the doctors, accepting help, and letting the people who love him stand beside him when the future was no longer in his own hands. After a lifetime of trying to prove that a real man has to endure everything himself, Terry Bradshaw finally understood that surviving has never been an individual sport. At the age of 77, Terry Bradshaw can look back on his life through 4 images that seem to belong to 4 different people. A young quarterback who entered Pittsburgh with a strong arm but was doubted about his mind, was replaced, was forced to prove over and over that he deserved the #1 spot. Another Terry standing under the bright lights, lifting the 4th Lombardi Trophy, twice Super Bowl MVP, finally making all of America admit that the man they had once doubted had become a legend. Then there is the Terry Bradshaw of 1999, when there was no longer a helmet, no longer a scoreboard, only a broken marriage, the pain of being away from his 2 daughters, panic attacks, and a clinical depression diagnosis that forced him to understand there are opponents that cannot be defeated by willpower. And finally the Terry of the present, still sitting at the Fox NFL Sunday desk at 77, still laughing loudly, still joking, still talking about the sport that gave him everything and also took away quite a bit. Perhaps that is exactly what we have always felt but never seen completely. Terry Bradshaw's laughter has never meant he did not know pain. The cheerfulness is real. The confidence is real. But the insecurity is also real. The depression is also real. The toughness is also real. They are not 2 separate lives, but parts that exist together in one person who took decades to learn how to accept all of them. When he was young, Terry thought strength was not being benched, getting up after a hit, throwing a touchdown when others mocked him, and lifting the trophy in front of those who had said he was not good enough. But the part of life after football forced him to learn a harder definition. Strength can be walking into the therapy room, accepting medication, admitting he is not okay, loving one more time after 3 failed marriages, letting Tammy stand beside him when he faced illness, watching Rachel go through the pain of losing her husband without being able to fix everything for his child, building with Aaron, Lacey, and the grandchildren a family that is not perfect but still choosing to stay together after divorce, overdose, widowhood, depression, and cancer. And there is an irony that is almost beautiful in that entire journey. The man who was once mocked as not smart enough to be a quarterback finally spent more than 3 decades being paid to analyze football for all of America. At 77, Terry Bradshaw does not need another touchdown, another ring, or another compliment to prove he belongs in history. 4 Lombardi trophies already proved he knew how to win when millions of people were watching. But the years after that proved he knew how to get back up when there was no longer a scoreboard, no longer cheering, and no trophy that could solve the pain for him. Perhaps the most painful truth is not that Terry Bradshaw endured too much. It is that he spent most of his life trying to prove he was good enough, while his worth never lay only in winning. And that is also why, after everything time has taken away, number 12 still deserves to be remembered by America, not only as a champion, but as a man who learned how to keep living when winning was no longer the answer. If the story of Terry Bradshaw makes you believe that real strength does not lie in never falling, but in the ability to stand up after losses that seemed impossible to overcome, please subscribe to the channel so that together we can explore more extraordinary lives behind America's spotlight. Thank you for staying until the end of the story of the legendary number 12, and see you in the next video with another journey of resilience, loss, and the strength of the human spirit.